Truth does not fear enemies. It only fears those who remain silent before it. The studio of The Nation Speaks, one of America's top political shows, is hotter than ever tonight. Bright lights reflect off the transparent glass tables, off the sharp gazes in the room. A massive media machine is in motion, capturing every second, every expression of the showdown about to unfold. Beyond these walls, the streets of New York shine with neon lights. In bars, offices, and homes across the country, millions are glued to their screens, anticipating a battle with no mercy. A duel of wits, meticulously prepared for weeks by Ethan Carter, the renowned host with a tongue as sharp as a razor. He has planned every move, crafted every question like bullets loaded into a chamber, ready to pull the trigger at the perfect moment. Facing him is J.D. Vance, the newly appointed Vice President of the United States, a former Marine, a Harvard-trained lawyer, a man who once fiercely criticized Donald Trump, yet now stands as his right-hand man. Before stepping onto the stage, Vance glances at an old photo on his phone, a picture of his grandmother sitting on a worn-out wooden chair in a small Ohio kitchen, clutching a Bible tightly. Taking a deep breath, he feels his heart pounding, not out of anxiety, but out of duty. This is not just an interview. Vance slides his phone into his pocket and steps out from backstage. The stage lights shine directly on him, and the battle officially begins. Carter speaks first, his voice smooth yet razor sharp. Mr. Vice President, your journey is remarkable. From someone who called President Trump a national disaster in Hillbilly Elegy back in 2016 to becoming his right-hand man today in 2025, how do you explain this 180-degree transformation? The question fires off like the opening shot, and the audience holds their breath. Vance smiles, not a defensive smile, but the smile of a man who sees the trap laid before him. Ethan, I'm glad you started there, he responds, his voice deep and unwavering. Because this isn't just my story. It's America's story. Facing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes you. And Carter smirks, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table like the beat of war drums. Truth or political opportunity, Mr. Vice President? In 2016, you wrote that Trump was cultural heroin for the white working class. Now here you sit in a $1,000 suit as his spokesperson after he won re-election with 76 million votes. Don't you find that hypocritical? His tone drips with sarcasm. The audience murmurs. Vance leans forward, his gaze locking onto Carter's like an arrow piercing the dark. Ethan, you want to talk about hypocrisy? Let me tell you a lesson from Iraq back when I was a Marine. I once doubted a sergeant. Thought he was just a hothead, unreliable, but then I saw him run into gunfire, dragging a wounded comrade out of the line of fire, blood pouring down his hands. I was wrong, and I admitted it. Hypocrisy isn't changing your mind when you see the truth. It's clinging to outdated beliefs just to satisfy people like you. People who have never set foot in a town like Middletown, Ohio, to understand why those people turn their backs on empty promises. When I criticized Trump, I hadn't met him. I relied on the distorted picture painted by you and your colleagues. But then I saw him walk into shuttered factories in Pennsylvania, talk to workers who had lost their jobs, and actually do something for them. Not just make empty speeches. He fought for the forgotten. 3.5 million new jobs before the pandemic, 500,000 of them in manufacturing, returning to states like Ohio and Pennsylvania. Have you ever been to those places to ask what they think, or do you just judge from the comfort of this studio? Carter smirked, but there was a fleeting unease in his eyes. So, did you change because of empathy? Or because the vice presidency was your reward for loyalty after Trump won with 52% of the popular vote in 2024? Vance let the silence stretch for a second, just long enough for its weight to sink in, then responded, his voice as sharp as a hammer striking an anvil. Ethan, you're so obsessed with finding contradictions in my story that you're blind to reality. I didn't change for power. I changed because I saw a man who put America first. The man who brought unemployment down to 3.5% in 2019, the lowest in 50 years, while you and your colleagues spent $4.5 billion on ads against him in 2020, according to Ad Age. Do you ever ask yourself why 76 million Americans voted for him last year? Or do you just assume they're a bunch of idiots, unworthy of your concern? An amen echoed from the audience, and Carter clenched his stack of cue cards, trying to regain the upper hand. Come on now, Mr. Vice President. Don't turn this into a sermon. Let's talk about your speech at the National Prayer Breakfast last week. You said divine guidance should shape government. Don't you think that's dangerous, blending church and state in a diverse country where tens of millions don't follow any religion? This isn't the Middle Ages. The question landed like a bomb, and Carter glanced at the audience, searching for validation. But Vance didn't blink. He leaned forward, eyes ablaze, his voice thunderous. Ethan, you've just stepped into a realm you don't understand. The founding fathers didn't fear faith, they feared tyranny. When I placed my hand on the Bible to take my oath, I wasn't establishing a state religion. I was reminding people that our freedoms don't come from you, don't come from Washington, but from a higher principle, one you might mock, but that millions rely on to get through their darkest days. You want to talk about diversity? Go to a church in Detroit where I've seen single mothers pray that their sons don't die from the drugs pouring across our borders. Go to a farm in Iowa where farmers kneel and thank God for their harvest after years of drought. Faith isn't a threat, it's their strength. Have you ever stepped outside this studio to see that, or do you just sit here and sneer? The audience erupted in applause, and Carter's face flushed red. He tried to interject. But in a modern society with 47 million immigrants and hundreds of beliefs, Vance raised a hand, cutting him off, respectful but unyielding. Let me finish, Ethan, because you need to hear this. You want to talk about modern society? Look at the 73% of Americans who say they feel this country is losing its traditional values. Those are the people who go to church, work 60-hour weeks, and fear their children will die from the drugs flooding our streets. 2 million pounds of fentanyl seized in 2023. Faith isn't the problem. Your indifference is. Have you ever asked why 62% of voters in America's poorest counties supported Trump in 2024? Or do you think they're not smart enough for your attention? Carter curled his lips, struggling to reclaim control. You talk about faith a lot, but let's talk about Trump. Last week, you called him God's instrument for America's rebirth. Isn't that extreme in a country where millions see him as a divisive figure, someone who's polarized America more than ever? The question was a dagger, and the audience held its breath. Vance smiled, the smile of a man who had been waiting for this moment. Extreme, Ethan? I think what's extreme is you sitting here mocking a man for praying while millions of families lose their jobs, their homes, their hope. And Trump was the one who walked into those communities, listened to them when no one else would. I called him God's instrument, not because I think he's perfect, but because I see him doing what you won't. Going to forgotten towns, standing before the abandoned, and giving them a reason to believe. You want to talk about division? Look at how you and your colleagues turn everything into a joke, from people's faith to their suffering. That's the real division. When you think you have the right to decide who deserves to be heard. Carter leaned back, but he wasn't finished fighting. You talk about results, but let's look at your own record. You used to be the voice of the working class in Hillbilly Elegy. Now you wear $1,000 suits and sit in the Capitol while 46% of American workers earn less than $15 an hour. Isn't that ironic? His words were sharp as a blade, but Vance replied with an unsettling calm. Ironic, Ethan? What's ironic is that you think a suit erases a man's worth. I grew up in Middletown, Ohio, where my grandmother worked 12-hour shifts in a factory for $7 an hour to raise me. When you mock me for wearing this suit, you mock every American who climbed out of poverty. People who don't apologize for success, but don't forget where they came from either. You know what? In 2023, 14.5 million children live below the poverty line, more than the population of 10 states combined. Have you ever visited a town like mine to ask what they need, or do you just judge them from a studio where you make $2 million a year? Ethan, you want to talk about credibility? Credibility isn't clinging to past mistakes to please you. Credibility is having the courage to admit when you were wrong and standing up for what you believe. When I wrote those words, I hadn't met Trump, But then I saw him go to Flint, Michigan, stand among laid off workers, and listen when no one else cared. I saw him fight to bring hope to forgotten places, not with empty promises, but with action. You call that a reversal, I call it growth. Something you might not understand because you've never had to confront the truth beyond this studio. Carter recoiled slightly but still snarled. You're an intellectual, a Yale Law graduate, and now you defend a man you once despised? Don't you see the contradiction? Vance tilted his head, his gaze cutting through Carter's facade like a blade. Contradiction, Ethan? Contradiction is how you call yourself a voice for truth but can't handle it when someone changes their mind based on reality. Yes, I went to Yale, but I didn't let academia blind me to what I saw with my own eyes. Trump standing up for coal miners in West Virginia, farmers in Iowa, mothers in Detroit, people you'll never bother to meet. You call that contradiction? I call that seen through the hypocrisy, not of Trump, but of people like you who think intelligence means looking down on others instead of lifting them up. The audience erupted in thunderous applause, and Carter nearly lost control. He slammed his hand on the table, his voice trembling with anger. You're making me the villain, but let's talk about your faith. Last week, I called it an election ploy. And here's the proof. I have a 2017 NPR interview where you said religion is sometimes used to manipulate voters. Now you stand here citing the Bible as a political tool? How do you explain that? The studio fell into a deathly silence. The audience held their breath. The production crew exchanged tense glances, and a few whispered in astonishment. Carter smirked triumphantly, his hands shaking as he gripped his cue cards, believing he had just delivered the knockout blow. But Vance didn't flinch. He let out a small chuckle, the laugh of a man who had just seen the entire chessboard, then leaned forward, his voice low but as sharp as a steel blade slicing through the air. Ethan, you just did something incredible. You proved me right. Thank you for digging up that quote. Yes, I did say that in 2017, and I still believe it today. Religion is sometimes abused to manipulate voters, just like how you and your colleagues weaponize faith to attack it instead of trying to understand why it matters to millions. But let me make something clear. When I knelt to pray with my grandmother in Ohio, when we had only a few coins to get through the week, that wasn't manipulation. That was a living truth, the fire that kept us standing. You want to use my own words against me? Listen carefully. In 2017, I was talking about hollow politicians, those who wear faith like a costume during election season and discard it once the cameras are off. I am not that man. I was going to church long before you knew my name, and I will be there long after you've forgotten it. The audience murmured, and scattered applause began to rise. Carter opened his mouth to counter, but Vance raised a hand, his voice ringing out like a final hammer strike. We're not done, Ethan, because if you want to broaden the discussion, I'll give you exactly what you asked for. You mock my faith, but let's look at reality. Millions of Americans kneel every night, not because they are manipulated, but because they see their children dropping out of school, their families falling apart, their communities drowning in drugs. They don't need you to tell them that prayer is outdated. They need someone who understands that these values are what keep America standing when everything else collapses. You wanted to use my words from 2017 to shame me? I'll use them to expose you. You don't care about truth. You just want a moment to show off. But here's what you didn't expect. Truth doesn't need your approval. It only needs the courage to be spoken. The studio exploded with thunderous applause, and Carter shrank back, his hands trembling, his victorious smirk vanishing. He stammered, You twisted my words. Vance leaned in, his gaze like a dagger piercing through Carter's last line of defense, his voice calm but chillingly sharp. No, Ethan, I stripped you bare. You invited me here to humiliate me, but you can't handle the truth. A man like me, who grew up poor, went to Yale, and still holds on to his faith, doesn't fit your narrative. What you fear is that millions of Americans don't need you to define their lives for them. They see me standing here, unapologetic in my beliefs, and they know that character is a game you play. You want to talk about manipulation? Look at how you turn other people's pain into a prop for your show. That's manipulation, not my prayer. The Carter slumped into his chair, his face pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. The audience stood up, the applause rolling through the studio like thunder, drowning out every other sound. Vance stood, turning directly to the camera, his voice ringing out like a declaration. People of America, this wasn't just an interview, this was a battle. Not with Ethan, but with the arrogance of those who think they can mock your faith, distort your values, and tell you to be ashamed of loving your country. I am not here to apologize for my past or my beliefs. I am here to tell you, stand strong. From the days in Iraq to the nights in Ohio, from the factories in Flint to the Capitol, I have learned that truth doesn't need anyone's permission, it only needs the courage to stand. And today, we have stood. As Vance walked out, the audience's applause roared, shaking the studio. Carter sat motionless, hollow-eyed, his ambush shattered by a man who wielded not just sharp logic, but the heart of a warrior. This wasn't just a debate, it was an unshakable affirmation of faith, truth, and the enduring power of values that had long been dismissed. The studio was silent. Ethan Carter lowered his head, his hands clutching the now useless stack of cue cards. He had come here to destroy J.D. Vance, but in the end, he was the one left in ruins. Vance rose, not in haste, not needing any further justification. The stage lights illuminated the face of a man who had won not just a debate, but had solidified an unbreakable conviction. Outside, New York still glittered, but tonight, millions of Americans weren't just watching their screens. They had seen a man willing to stand for them. Without looking back, without hesitation, J.D. Vance walked out of the studio, carrying the truth like a sword. This battle was over. But the war for faith had only just begun. If you enjoyed this story, hit like and subscribe, because faith, family, and freedom are not just words, they are the flames that guide us through the darkness. God bless you and God bless America.